Hi guys, this is another quick video in the series of using the Z28 spring. I've gotten a bunch of messages from guys not quite understanding the term Z28 spring. The, they also have kind of got on my case about using it as a generic term, but it really is a generic term for a type of spring. The original Z28 back in the 60s had a performance spring in it, and that's where the original name came from. And that spring is only good to 500 lift. So you probably don't want to be using that particular spring. But the family of Z28 springs means that they are all between 1 240 and 1 260 in diameter to where they fit a small block Chevrolet. So it's in that family that we're using, that Z28 family of springs. Now they come in the standard Z28 spring, which is 500 lift. They come in a 550 lift, and they come in a 600 lift. Now I prefer the 600 lift one, partly because of the installed height. With this spring, because it goes in at a higher installed height, remember, the Caddy is a tall spring. The Cadillac is in at 1,950. I can put this spring in at 1,850, and technically the spring is good for 650 lift at that point. But I only have clearance to the guide for 600 lift, which is okay. I don't want the spring to necessarily go all the way down to the bottom of its cycle. Now, there's a whole bunch of other springs. I mean, Howard's makes a spring, Isky makes springs, and some of them are beyond even this spring. There's even a double spring version of this that has an inner spring, though you'd have to cut away the bottom part of this tapered guide in order for that spring to actually fit. So you'd have to modify the cylinder heads to go to that Z28 style spring that's double spring. Now, I'm not talking about the dampener. The dampener is just there to try and prevent the spring from oscillating. We need to pull those out because they don't clear here. You either have to cut this part down, make it smaller, or you have to pull this out of the spring. Now, this is the 600 lift spring that I'm going to be using. If you look up Z28 spring, 600 lift, or it might say plus 100, because the stock one was 500 lift, and that doesn't help you much over stock. I mean, that just gives you a little stronger spring. So this spring gives you more room to where you can deal with more lift. Now, most of us with a regular motor are probably going to be around 550 lift. Now, you might look into some of these other springs. This spring is only like a $60, $70 spring. I mean, these springs, these 500 lift ones, I mean, you can buy them for $35, $40. I mean, there are guys that sell them even cheaper than that are pulling them out of heads because they don't want to use them. So, but it's not a lot of use. I realize it's cheap, but it's not a lot of use. This one is still fairly inexpensive at like 60, 70 bucks. It gives you more. The spring has room. You can see it's got room inside to go to a higher lift. It goes right in on the head, even on the car, with that flat retainer that I showed you before. You know, it's a flat Renegade retainer. Now, that works out real well, and that's what I was trying to do, is to make it all fit on the motor, you know, air up a cylinder, swap a spring, which we're going to do here in a bit. But there are other springs, and some of these get to be a lot more money. I mean, you can spend 150 up to probably even, you know, 210, 220 on a set of, you know, 250 or around there diameter springs. Now, if you really wanted to run the original 60 Z28 spring, technically you can, and that's where I started way back. I mean, we're talking 30 years ago. You used a crane retainer, and they're still around, though they're going to be harder to find. These are a drop retainer, and that brings your installed height down to the 1750 for the regular original 60s version Z28 spring. But you don't have a lot of room in here. You're probably going to have to cut the guide down, and the spring's still only good for 500 lift. So at this point, I don't really see why you would want to use that spring. And that's not the spring I'm talking about in this series when I'm talking about a Z28 spring. I've said several times that it's the 600 lift or plus 100 spring that I'm using with this retainer to go in there that I think is a good fit for just a regular motor. Now, if you're going to run a roller cam, you need more spring pressure. You know, there are stiffer versions. You're going to pay more. But if you look in the Z28 family, this, you know, like I said, 1/240 to 1/260 diameter, and this retainer will work on almost all of these. You can find springs that are, you know, it might say 135 seat or 145 seat, and it's going to be at 1/800. But it's also going to be, I mean, they make these in Pacalloy. Years ago, I used a version of this that was Crane H11. That's a tool steel spring, till we found out that they break. But I used that for quite a while, the same basic setup. It's just a better material, so it has a higher spring rate. And you can look at that when you're looking at springs. You know, it may say spring rate is 360, you know, per inch, or 380 or 420 per inch. And from that, you can kind of figure out where you're going to be sitting. And like I said, all the companies, there's everybody makes these types of springs because it was for small block Chevrolet, and that was the bread and butter motor for decades until we got to LS. So, like I said, there's a whole bunch of springs in this family, and you need to look at what you're actually buying. Again, just to reiterate, this is the 600 lift spring. So that's 600 lift when it's installed at 1/800, and the coil bind happens at like 1/200. So we're installing a 1/850. That means we actually have 50 thousandths extra. It'd be good for like 650 lift, though that's not enough pressure for a cam that's 650 lift. I'll tell you that right now. You need a stronger spring. But just in general, that leaves us an extra 50 thousandths, and we can only go down, remember, to like I forget what it was from the other video, 1/250 or something. And so we're going to have just a little bit of extra in the spring, but we still have room for that 600 lift, and I'm only really planning on going to 550. So that means the spring won't go solid ever. That means that the bottom of the retainer is not going to hit the top of the guide. And that also means that everything is going to work without me having to worry about the spring. That's why I'm putting them in now. So down the road, if I get rid of the stock cam, or I might go to a higher ratio rocker, or whatever. I mean, if I go to a bigger cam, I can literally at that point just throw a cam in or throw rockers in, and as long as I know that I'm only shooting for something under 600, I know I'm good to go. And like I said, I like it because this spring isn't that expensive. Now, it's also not a high rate spring. One of the worries that guys have is, oh my God, it's going to break the rocker arm. Well, no. What breaks the rocker arms is when these go solid, or when the retainer starts impacting the top of the guide because you didn't have enough room, or the piston's hitting the top of or the valve is hitting the top of the piston. That's what's usually breaking rocker arms. Now, they are not the strongest thing. That's also why I'm going to this spring. You know, this is only giving me, stock is 60. This is giving me like 100, maybe 105 seat and like 250 open. This was, stock was 155 open. So I'm adding 100 extra pounds open pressure, which should help with more RPM than the stock motor was designed to deal with. And it'll let me run a small cam as long as I pay attention to ramp speed. I don't need a lot of spring pressure. Part of the reason I ran that tool steel spring years ago is I had a much more aggressive cam. And so with the more aggressive cam, I had to run a spring that had better material so that I had more spring pressure. And it was like 140 seat and 300 and just over open. So it was bigger than this spring, and that's what I'm saying. There are other choices in this family. Like I said, if you're running, you know, a roller or maybe just a hydraulic roller, you might want to look at something that's a little more stout. You know, it's going to be a little more expensive. You know, you're going up from a $60 spring to maybe a $150 spring, but it's going to be a better material, and so it's going to have a higher spring rate, and that'll help deal with the higher ramp speed of the roller cam. So when I'm saying Z28 and all these things, I am not talking about just this spring. I'm talking about the family of springs. And the only reason we're using them is because that's the same basic diameter as the Cadillac spring. So I am guaranteed it's going to clear the rocker arm. I am guaranteed it fits the seat well, because if you look here, these seats are not big diameter. I mean, you can't really go to a larger diameter spring without doing something about the seat. So that's why I try and stick to these 250 or so springs, is because they actually fit down here on the seat. And you just have to decide what retainer. Now, there's all sorts of retainers for Chevrolet, and they're not all the same. I keep saying this one is flat. The reason I like that is because it drops my height from 950 to 850. It takes 100 thousandths out. Now you could go even lower if you wanted, but the lower you go, the less room there is for spring. If you look at these, you pull the damper out. If you look at these, as they go up in lift, the spring is actually getting taller and taller. And there's a reason for that. You with the particular wire size, you can only fit so much. So it usually has to go taller in order to have room for more lift. And in the Caddy, we have the room. In Chevrolet, you sometimes had to go to a longer valve or do something to make the room. You know, and that's why I'm saying something about retainer. In Chevrolet, retainers that fit these springs, some of them are cupped in here. And that's to give the spring, push the spring up and give you more installed height so that you have more room for the spring to compress and deal with more lift. But if you use one of those springs on a Cadillac, you're going up from 950. You may have a 2-inch installed height, and that's no good for the spring. If you look, it's just going to rattle around in there. It's not even going to go closed. And so you need to look at some of the numbers and read what it is you're looking for, and pick out the spring that's going to work for what you're doing and the cam you're doing. And the spring has less to do about RPM and more to do about ramp speed. So even if you're running a hydraulic roller, which is still fairly mellow in the roller world, you need to go to a little stiffer spring pressure to deal with the fact that the roller has a faster ramp. And so it's going to be trying to toss that valve open. If you go to a solid roller, well, you're going to need a big old spring, and you're probably going to look at cutting the pocket. You know, and I have done that. I've run a solid, and I ran a big old, 1/450 diameter spring. But I had to do all sorts of stuff to make that work, and this is about keeping it simple and keeping the cost down. And that's why I chose the 600 spring. Is it's just a little bit bigger. The stock rocker arms are going to be okay. The installed height is correct. I have room for just a little bit more lift, so I can run a little bit more cam. And it's basically a drop-in to where I don't have to pull the heads and machine them. So that's just a quick bit about the Z28 spring itself. And if I wasn't clear in the previous videos, which I thought I was, I'm sorry, but this should hopefully clear it up for you guys looking for springs. So our next step is to see if we can't get the spring that I like onto the motor while the motor's still assembled. So that's going to be the next video. Talk to you later. Bye.